Let me introduce tonight's guests. We have Shanta Wilkinson. Shanta.
Yay, come on.
Yay! In addition to being our amazing board president here at the library, Shanta is founder of Shanta Wilkinson Consulting, providing diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting and assistance to organizations implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies and best practices. She is a graduate. Yes, let's have a round of applause. A little bit of subtext there. All right. She is a graduate of Rutgers University Law School and previously served as a Deputy Attorney General and an EEO Affirmative Action Coordinator for the New Jersey Office of Attorney General. And then we all know this man, Paul Sparrow. Yes. Round of applause for Paul. Writer, historical consultant, and the former director of the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. And before that, he was the deputy director and senior vice president at the Newseum in Washington, D.C. And he is the author of the book, Awakening the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh and the Battle to Save Democracy. And he is fresh off the Savannah Book Festival. So he's fancy now. So with that, I will turn it over to the two of you.
A round of applause for Rebecca, please. She is the hardest working woman in showbiz. All right, so this is a little bit of a different program for me. The idea around, still can't hear it. How's this? Let's see, is that better? How's that? There you go. Can you hear that? Or I'll just yell. There's a relationship here between Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune that is really special, but also reflective of both of these women and why they were so important. And when I first talked to Shanta, I said, let's do a program on Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune. And it was like, well, wait a minute, why don't we just do it about civil rights bigger? And then we realized, okay, just this program is going to take about 2.5 hours. So we have to keep narrowing it down. But this is a story that a lot of people don't know. She is not as recognized, or at least until very recently was not as recognized as she should be. So tonight we're going to try to remedy that. So we're going to start real quickly with her background, which is humble almost beyond belief. You want to?
Yes. Can everyone hear me? Great. So Mary was one of 17 children, and she was a child of formerly enslaved people. So what we have on the screen is the very humble beginnings in the home that she lived in. And I use the word home, but as you look closely at the picture, is not what one truly visualizes when you hear the term home, but her family was able to make this home for her and her siblings. Despite her very humble beginnings, as you can see on the screen, we have a sketch of her parents. She was very proud of her parents and extremely close to her parents. And it's evident that they instilled a love for education and a love of learning to Mary at a very young age. Her mother worked land that the family grew cotton on. And here's an interesting fact about Mary. By the age of 9, she could pick 250 pounds of cotton per day. And yes, per day. And she used that hard work, that ethic, and a quest to want to learn more and to know more as she carried her way throughout her schooling and her education. Mary was able to attend a school, seminary school, actually it was a boarding school in North Carolina on a scholarship. And from there, she wanted to serve as a missionary and to do work as a missionary, but no one would sponsor her. So from there, she kind of pivoted to education, and then her journey really took off from there.
Eleanor Roosevelt had a slightly different childhood. This is the home that she lived in after she was orphaned, and this is known as Oak Terrace, which is up in the Hudson Valley. Her uncle, Teddy, was president of the United States. And Eleanor was one of his favorite nieces, so he spent a lot of time, sort of nurturing her and taking care of her. Her family, actually part of it, Teddy's mother, were Southern and had owned slaves. Actually, her grandmother was originally from Savannah, Georgia. She started the Savannah Book Festival. No, I'm just. And so she had come from a background in which, she frequently used the word pickaninny in referring to black children, and often used the N word, and was not, especially as a child, was surrounded by a world in which the only black people she ever encountered were servants. So she's coming in a path that's very typical for women of her status and class, but not one that would have predicted her future activities. And so she said about Mary going to these schools, the Scotia Seminary for Negro girls, and then the Moody Bible Institute. And this is where she developed what she called her philosophy of female uplift. Female uplift is a simple concept, but remember, this is a terrible time in American history for blacks and for women, and for black women particularly bad. And this idea that she had that she could educate girls to prepare them for leadership in her communities.
And I think it's great, Paul, that you referenced the female uplift, because that is something that, Mary truly embodied that. Once she left her southern states and transferred to Florida. And while in Florida, she was married and she had a son. During her time in Florida, she and her husband separated, ultimately divorced, I believe, but I'm not even sure, that's questionable, but they did separate. And after she separated from her husband, at the time she was selling insurance, but because her vision was one of female empowerment and uplifting, while raising her son as a single mother, she decides to open a school for girls, a school for Black girls. At the time, the school was originally called the Daytona Educational and Industrial Training School for Negro Girls. She opened that in 1904, and it's very important when we talk about this school. Paul and I had an opportunity earlier today when we were talking, and I was saying some of the facts that I thought was so important about the school. When you hear that Mary opened a school, you initially your mind goes to, this is great. She's educating girls. This is a brick and mortar school. This school was so much more than that. It was she saw it, her vision was that it was necessary for the school to not only educate the children, but to also uplift the community. So what the children would do in the school, the girls, some of the things that they would do is, as they were learning to read, they would then go out into the community and teach others to read. And they were teaching others to read so those others could then go to vote. Another thing that was very important to Mary, as we will discuss throughout today, education and voting, and align with that, in addition to teaching the residents in the local community how to read, the girls would also do fundraisers. So, because we're at a time where those who were able to vote, there was a poll tax, and many of the individuals in the communities could not afford and did not have the funds for the poll tax. It was appalling, and it was especially upsetting to Mary. So she made sure she would do everything that she could to ensure that her students were able to allow community members to vote. So to do that, they would do fundraisers. One other thing about Mary, she was a true business woman and was always business minded. When she realized that there was a need for not only her girls at her school, but in the community for adequate health care, she actually helped open a medical facility and a nursing school. So she was a person, and I would say both her and Eleanor, and eventually we'll talk about their relationship, but both of those women, they were true visionaries, and they were able to see beyond what the circumstances were at the current time. When we think about Mary in this school, it's very important to realize that the school eventually merged with another institution.
I'm gonna stop you for a second, because later in life, when she was asked about how she was able to start this school, she said, quote, $1.50, faith in God, and 5 little girls. That's what she started with. And they used discarded crates and boxes served as their chairs and desks. And she was able to build this too. Now you can pick up.
And she was able to build this institute into Bethune-Cookman University. So eventually the school merged with, so we took her school and then it ultimately merged with another institution. And at that time, that was an all-male institution. And via the merger, it was able to be a co-ed institution, which ultimately became a 4-year accredited university, a historical Black college and university. And it's something important when we think about Mary as a business-minded person. To merge with another college takes a lot of work, and it shows her negotiation skills. Mary successfully negotiated this institution, and as you can see, her name is first. It is Bethune-Cookman, so that shows you the type of leader and the type of woman that Mary is. But this is an HBCU that is still around today. It has graduated several illustrious alumni, and it is still a very prominent school within the
Was
South.
the first college that Black women were allowed to attend in America. Opened in 1923. So Mary McLeod Bethune, I love this picture. She became the president of the National Association of Colored Women in 1924, shortly after she started the Bethune School. And this was a very important organization because it was it was sort of the leadership organization for a group of ladies clubs around the countries, which were vitally important for civic engagement, for these small groups of Black women to meet sort of under the radar. Because again, in a lot of the southern states, if the white overlords found out you were meeting, they would send the KKK after you and they would burn you out. I mean, it was dangerous time to be organizing. So why don't you talk a little bit about this before we go on to how her and Eleanor met?
Yes, and the interesting part about Mary's role with this organization is that she was immediately elected to serve as president. And she had a vision for the organization. The organization was a true, we would say, social service women's social club. But in true Mary fashion, she wanted it to serve so much more. She wanted it to be a bit of a lobbying effort. She wanted to have an advocacy. She was leaning more towards social justice herself and leading initiatives for anti-lynching and other initiatives that were extremely important to her. So it was important for Mary to then allow this organization and to grow and to go into a different direction than what it was. And I think immediately she may have been hit with a bit of resistance, but ultimately the organization was able to evolve and become one that was focused on public health, social welfare programs, lobbying, and advocacy.
So there was a national organization called the National Council for Women, which the National Committee for Negro Women was sort of not really a part of, but a parallel group. So in 1927, Sara Roosevelt, Eleanor's mother-in-law, hosted a meeting of the National Council of Women and invited Mary McLeod Bethune. And she was the only Black woman there, and none of the white women in the room would sit down to lunch with her. So Sara took Mary by the arm and led her across the room and sat her next to Eleanor, and then sat on the other side of her at the head of the table, forcing all the other white women in the room to sit and have lunch with Mary McLeod Bethune. Now that tells you a lot about Sara, tells you a lot about Eleanor, tells you a lot about what Mary faced every day of her life. But it also says something about the start of this friendship. And this is this moment where Eleanor is sitting next to her and realizes very quickly, oh, this is a kindred spirit. I can work with her. And they did.
And I think it's important too, when we think back at that picture, when Paul and I were first discussing the picture and all of the emotions that are evoked when you look at the picture, if you think about what Mary had to be experiencing at this time, we're talking about a woman who at this point had several careers. She sold insurance, started an entire school for children, was a leader in multiple organizations, and still was invited to a luncheon where others would not welcome her. She was in a space where she was not welcomed, where she didn't feel belonged, but yet she still, she had this sense of pride and this self-respect and this dignity, and which ultimately led to a wonderful relationship that we'll discuss a bit later. But it is very important to think about what it must have felt for Mary in that moment, at that time when that picture was taken, that someone welcomed her. They provided a sense of belonging to her. They let her know that she belonged there. Despite everything that she had accomplished before she got there, she was still relegated to that other woman, that Black woman in the corner who we will not interact with. So there's a lot in that one photograph.
So they met in 1927, and Franklin was elected governor of New York in 1928. And Eleanor started becoming more involved with the political side of the family operation. Now, she had been involved with settlement houses in New York and helping immigrant children and a lot of, socially conscious activities, but she hadn't been particularly involved in a lot of what we would think of as civil rights activities. Then, in 1933, President Roosevelt, or Franklin Roosevelt, becomes president of the United States, and this marks a very distinct change in how Eleanor starts to use her power. She had been terrified about moving to the White House and living in the fishbowl, and what was she going to do? And she didn't want to just give tea parties and host garden parties. She wanted to continue to be active. And one of the first things she decided she was going to do was get very involved in bringing the civil rights issues to the forefront of the Roosevelt agenda. Now you have to remember, up until this point, Blacks had voted overwhelmingly for Republicans. The Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln. So of course they're going to vote for him. There's Jesus and Lincoln on all their bedroom walls. So, this was a real challenge for them, for the Democrats, to try to figure out how do we serve the Black community and how do we get the Black voters. There was a cynical side to this, which is that we need the Black voters to be a part of our coalition, but we're made up of a bunch of Southern racists, so not a natural partnership there. Anyway, so this becomes a moment where Eleanor decides that there are things that she has to take a stand on. And one of the first things she does, she invites Walter White, the head of the NAACP, to the White House. Now, it's hard to, today, this is the 1934 meeting, so it's about a year after they entered the White House, how wildly controversial this was. Now, Walter White passed for White, but he was the head of the NAACP. And this was a meeting where she was bestowing upon him a credibility that was priceless to him, the NAACP, but more important, it was her planting her flag in the ground and saying, okay, this is my cause now.
And what I find so interesting about this, and then how Mary enters into the discussion, even we're talking, they're at the White House now. One interesting point, when we go back to right before they got in the White House and when FDR was on the campaign trail, and Mary was a big surrogate for him, which we would consider to be a surrogate today. And she did I think an address or made an endorsement for him on the radio to say, I strongly stand behind this candidate. I endorse this candidate. I put my full support and weight behind him. And Mary was very revered in the Black community. So that endorsement went a long way. And it's, many question how she helped land him into the White House along with the Black vote, because that was such a very strong endorsement. And then to segue into, once they're in the White House and you have Walter White, the leader of the NAACP, being invited into the White House, and then subsequently Mary's role, major pivotal role in the White House during this time, is monumental. And it's when we were talking several times about Eleanor, to me, one of her biggest strengths is that she's a person that recognized her power and when it was necessary to lean into that power. Eleanor had a strength that I think she was masterful at that, and that is just such a true skill set and a knack and a gift that not everyone has, but she was very intentional with every action that she took. And this is an illustration of that intentionality, where she invited Walter White, head of the NAACP, at a time when that was something that would never be heard of, and then how that relationship blossomed from there.
one of the biggest issues for the Black community was lynching. In the early 1930s, lynching was common. You know, after World War I, the KKK had a resurgence. There was a real effort. Woodrow Wilson, as president, had basically fired all the blacks that had been allowed into the federal government. Washington was a Jim Crow city, and lynching was shockingly common. And so there was an effort that Mary was involved with, Walter White was involved with, and Eleanor Roosevelt got involved in to fight this idea of lynching. Eleanor testified, and this became one of the first flashpoints between her and her husband, because as I pointed out, about a third of the Democratic Party were Southern racists, and they controlled critical committees in both the Senate and the House because they had seniority, and so they would control what bills would go forward, who would get confirmed, all those sorts of things. And so Eleanor wanted FDR to support the first of the many federal anti-lynching laws that came through, this one about 1935, and he basically said, no, if I do that, then the Southern Democrats won't pass any of my New Deal legislation, and I can't risk it. And so it went, they were all defeated. At one point, Eleanor sat in the visitors' balcony watching, you know, the Southern Democrats boycott, you know, the attempt to get these bills passed. It was pretty shocking. Now, during this time, Mary becomes a member of the Roosevelt Administration through the National Youth Association.
In the National Youth Association, Mary served as the director of the Office of the Minority Affairs, and it's to be noted that at one point, was Mary the highest ranked Black official within the federal government? And that was a massive accomplishment at that time. Again, it talks to not only her strength and her level of experience, but also to her relationship. And this is a great picture with her behind the desk, but it also talks to her relationship with the Roosevelts and how she was seen as a true trusted advisor. One thing about Mary, and she was adamant about it, and it was great that both Eleanor and the president, FDR, that they recognize this, that if the aim is to address issues impacting the Black community, that you have to have a trusted advisor. You have to have someone who is of that community. And that still rings true today. If you're going to do the work to impact communities, you can't just talk at them, you have to talk with them and to them. And this is the true embodiment and definition of someone having a seat at the table and being in the room where it happens and playing a major role in these initiatives. One, during Mary's time and in her role, there were quite a few initiatives that she had. The whole purpose of her office was to provide youth employment opportunities, especially as a result of the Great Depression, and making sure that specifically Black youth employment opportunities, including, I think there were 6 camps, one even as close as here as New Jersey, and camps in other locations for girls to give them these educational opportunities. And from this office, she also springboarded a couple of other initiatives that we'll talk about briefly, but this was a very important role to have a woman, a Black woman, as the highest ranked Black official within the federal government, and that she was not just a figurehead. She was not there just signing documents. She was a trusted advisor of the president who, most importantly, had the ear to his wife.
Now, there are a couple of other critical players here. We're not going to go through all of them, but Judge Hasty was a Black jurist that was brought into the administration. Robert Van, who was a publisher of a Black newspaper in Pittsburgh, very, very powerful figure. And so the Roosevelt administration starts trying to hire Blacks to come in, although a lot of them were put in sort of figurehead positions where they were put in and given a title, but they weren't really given any authority. And about half of FDR's cabinet were openly racist men. They would not consider putting a Black in any sort of position of authority where they would control budgets or anything like that. They would sort of grudgingly accept them and let them in. A couple of prominent, exceptions. Francis Perkins, we'll be talking about in a month. Harold Ickes, the Interior Secretary, and then some of the critical players in the New Deal, Harry Hopkins, These people were actively trying any way they can to find ways to get blacks into positions that they could help influence policy, because that's what this was about. Because even the New Deal policies like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which should have helped all farmers because it gave money to farmers who couldn't sell their crops. What would happen is that the white farmers would take all the money, and instead of passing it down to the black sharecroppers, they would keep it. And then the black sharecroppers would go poor, and then they would buy their land from them and kick them off the land. So a lot of some of this New Deal legislation was used as weapons against the black community. So obviously having blacks in these policy positions was vitally important. And so Mary looked around and said, you know what? We need to get together.
And enter the Black cabinet. And if you look very closely at the picture, you can see who is dead center. It is Mary, where she rightfully belongs. Mary was the convener of the Black cabinet. She ran the meetings, and not in a secretarial role where sometimes women are relegated and delegated to that role, but she was a true leader or unofficial leader of the Black cabinet. And she was a leader. Okay. Oh,
He couldn't make it. They didn't have the meeting.
Yeah, that's it. If she wasn't there, then there was no meeting to be held. And you could tell that she, like Eleanor, they both recognized their power. Mary recognized the power that she had. She knew that she was convening, putting together this group of trusted advisors. And they were, again, the whole point and goal was to ensure that if you're going to be discussing issues impacting the Black community and discussing the New Deal and how that impacts the Black community, that it is imperative that you have individuals around the table who are of the Black community, and there is your Black cabinet.
It was very controversial about what roles they would play, what positions they would be put in, what they were allowed to do. And several of the most prominent members ended up quitting in frustration, feeling that they were just being used as window dressing, that they weren't really given authority or power. And it was quite controversial about how they should respond. Some of them wanted to be more aggressive. Some of them wanted to go to the press. Mary was always counseling, we need to work from within. We can't criticize the Roosevelt administration if you want them to keep us in the tent. You want to get back outside the tent, that's fine. But if you want to have any influence, you have to be inside the tent, in the room where it happens. Now, the stories about what they went through, they were not allowed to eat in the cafeterias. Harold Ickes, the Secretary of Interior, overruled the decision that they were not be allowed in and let them in. And then when it first started happening, when the Black staff would come into the cafeteria, all the white staff would leave. They would, the first day that they started serving them, one of the white servers took the plates off the table when they were done eating and threw them in the garbage. It's because white people wouldn't eat off a plate that a Black person had eaten off. Just, that's the context in which they were struggling, and every day going into work knowing you're facing this enormous resistance to your even being there. And yet they persevered, and they accomplished a lot. They didn't accomplish everything they wanted to accomplish, but they accomplished a lot. You want to talk about Marion? This is them at a meeting. I believe the man standing behind Mary there is the head of the Tuskegee Institute. Now, Mary's role as sort of the leader of the Black cabinet and a highly respected member of the Black community made her very influential in the 1936 presidential election, because she could sway the Black vote. And FDR really wanted to shift that Black vote from the Republican side to the Democratic side. And she toured the country. She did a lot of speaking. She did radio announcements. She did articles. She did books. This is a moment where, as you said, she knew how to use her power.
How to use her power. And I know we'll talk a bit about the Tuskegee Institute and Tuskegee Airmen in further detail, but it is important because this was a part of her initiative and her charge and her role as a federal employee. She sought to integrate the armed forces and do a lot of work with trying to address segregation. And she thought it was very important that that was a big portion of her platform, was to ensure the integration of the armed forces. So this is how we start these discussions.
And she had other powerful friends too. The man on the left is Du Bois. The man on the right is Walter White. So she was associating with the very most powerful, most influential blacks in the country. And she was really the only woman at almost all of those meetings. And again, this was a powerful trio, but also it was just part of a much bigger network that were trying to get Roosevelt reelected in 1936. Now, this is a great picture. This is Eleanor visiting her at the Bethune-Cookman College. And I love the very subtle corsage Eleanor is wearing. But this is a period where after 1936, as you're getting towards the war, where it became very important that Mary keep the Black cabinet together because it was starting to fragment. And this is where she understood how to use her friendship with Eleanor.
And she used it in a way, and both women used it in a way where it was, when you look at Eleanor, and we'll talk about that a lot in the next slide, but you look at how she knew how to, step into that power and step into that role in a way where she wasn't overshadowing, but she was, you don't want to use the term legitimizing, but she was literally throwing her support and her weight behind something. If you explore the concept of the First Lady of the United States going to visit a college and going to visit a historical Black college in a southern state, that's a very powerful statement. Just showing up anytime any president visits a college is a major statement. But just at this time, visiting the college of her friend on that campus was a very strong statement without Eleanor even having to say much. She just knew what her presence and what showing up would mean for the institution and for the cause overall.
Also, as we said, Mary is a smart businesswoman. She knew that having the First Lady show up at her college raised the visibility of her college, and more people would apply to go there. And she also knew that being seen with Eleanor helped her political power in Washington on the battles inside the walls, right? Because she was fighting a battle every single day, keeping the Black cabinet together, making an influence. There was a lot of force at play in the Congress to defund these programs, to defund the National Youth Association, because they didn't like the fact that some of the money was going to these Black kids, right? So they wanted to defund the whole thing. We won't talk about contemporary political analysis, but there was a lot of direct attacks on her, on the work they were doing, and even on the very presence of Black people in the administration. But the Bethune-Cookman University wasn't the only important college that she visited. She visited the Tuskegee Institute. She was on good terms with them. And I have to say, this is one of my favorite pictures. I'm going to talk about it for a minute, then we'll let Mary talk about it, because at this point, 1941, Blacks were excluded from the military in any kind of combat role. There had been multiple meetings. The peacetime draft had been passed in October of 1940, which again kept in place the segregated military, and including unfair tests that the Blacks would have to pass to even be considered. And then they were given jobs like cooks or stevedores or basically unloading explosives. That's a whole nother, I should do an episode on that. And so there was a real sense among all white military leaders, that Blacks were not capable of, for example, flying fighter planes or taking command of a warship or even running a tank, much less commanding white officers. So she goes down there, and that's Anderson, what's his name? Charles Anderson, who was the flight instructor there. And she goes out to the runway and she goes, what do you do here? He says, well, I'm a flight instructor. She says, I didn't think Blacks were smart enough to fly. And he said, well, would you like to go for a flight? And in front of the press and the president of the university and all these people, she goes, I'd love to. and jumps in this little two-seater with him, and he flies her around for 45 minutes. Meanwhile, on the ground, total chaos. And so this is right after they land, with the press guy taking a picture of her, with, again, her knowing what her political power was. I love this picture.
It is a great picture on multiple levels, and you consider the fact that for 45 minutes, the First Lady of the United States, the white First Lady of the United States, was alone in an aircraft with a Black man for 45 minutes. It was a picture that speaks 1,000 words and then some. And again, it was just Eleanor knowing, this is when I show up, this is what I do. This one gesture of getting into this aircraft with this pilot, who at the time was, I believe, the first African-American pilot to have a commercial license. He was the epitome of excellence himself. He is often referred to as the father of Black aviation. And Charles Anderson, in 2014, he became the first Tuskegee Airman to have his own postage stamp. So we're talking about, she got behind it's not the wheels, but I'm gonna say the wheels of someone who was an extraordinary pilot. And they both knew in that moment what was occurring. I don't know if he knew or if she knew the historical impact of that moment, but I imagine they both did. And this picture is here to remind us of how, again, Eleanor just had that timing. That's something that you can't manufacture. I think today many people try to manufacture this, but this was something that was just innate and natural in her. She had this ability to know. This is, I guess, when she would say, okay, let me in, coach, tag me in. She knew when the appropriate time was to be tagged in. And this picture illustrates that.
And so Mary, at this point, was working very hard to get Black women into the military through the WAX program, 8666, 6888.
Yeah.
6888,
right?
If you haven't seen the movie, see it. It's a wonderful movie. It talks about Mary's efforts and the things that these women were subjected to be successful, but they were able to do it. But there was a huge battle going on now in Washington about this issue of what role are Blacks going to play in World War II, because the whites in control didn't want the Blacks playing a role at all. But the reality was they needed the men, right? They needed manpower. So this is A. Philip Randolph on the left, Asa Philip Randolph. He was the head of the Sleeping Car Porters Union, which is the largest Black union in America. And again, I want to do a whole program on this, but people think Black sleeping car porters, really? They were vitally important because they brought information from the North, newspapers, letters, correspondence to the South, where if you were a Black and you tried to buy a Black newspaper, you would be beaten at the very least. So they had an underground communication system where they would come into town, they would drop these Black newspapers off secretly, and they would be distributed in the Black community. So in these very racist Southern towns, the Blacks would know what was going on. Anyway, so he met with Roosevelt in 1940 first, saying, you've got to do something. And Roosevelt, in his typical, and I love FDR, but he would often just blow smoke on people's butts. And Randolph and Walter White in the meeting are basically like, Mr. President, you have to do something. You have to eliminate the segregation in the military. You have to make sure that there's opportunities for Blacks in the defense industry. You're spending all this money. We should be a part of it. There should be 10% of the population should have 10% of the jobs. And Roosevelt's like, yeah, sounds good. Don't worry, we'll take care of it. And then they leave and they think everything's great. And then 2 weeks later, the White House comes out with a press release saying the U.S. Army's policy on being a segregated military will remain in place. And they did absolutely nothing to help them. So this created quite a reaction from Randolph and White, and they decided they were going to make a march on Washington. And is this it? Yes. And so they're going to have this march on Washington, and they meet again with FDR. So July 1st, 1941, they're going to do this big march on Washington. They meet again with FDR. And this time, there's a bunch of people in the room, lots of tension. Everybody knows this is serious. And FDR basically says, stop the march. And they said, no. And he goes, how many people are going to show up, really? Washington being a racist city. And A. Philip Randolph says, 100,000. And Roosevelt puffs him off and says, Walter, how many people are really going to show up? Walter says, 100,000, Mr. President. Get into this big fight. Finally, Fiorello LaGuardia, you all know who Fiorello LaGuardia was, the pugnacious mayor of New York, who was the head of the Civilian Defense Corps, says, Mr. President, we're going to have to come up with a compromise. And they did, and they drafted Executive Order, was it, I'm sorry, I always forget the number, 8802, which says that hiring within the defense industry, you cannot discriminate on race, creed, color, country of origin, or religion. And this was a big deal. Historians have said this was the most important civil rights act by the federal government since Reconstruction in the 1870s. So it was really important. It was a major victory, and basically they forced him, FDR, to do this. And Mary and Eleanor, working behind the scenes, had made this happen and sort of set the table for this. So it's a vitally important thing. Now, one of my favorite things that Mary did, do you want to say anything more about this before we go?
No.
One of my favorite things about Mary is
the United Negro College Fund, and that she is one of the founders of the United Negro College Fund. And this fund is to provide funds and resources to historically Black colleges and universities. And it is important to note that Mary was a co-founder along with one of the Rockefellers, as well as we talked about Tuskegee University at the time, Tuskegee Institute at that time, as well as the president of Tuskegee Institute. I think his name is Frederick Patterson. They were the co-founders of the United Negro College Fund. So this is just yet another example of the massive reach that Mary had. For many of us, myself included, before I knew quite a bit about Mary. I wouldn't say that I didn't, but the more that I got to learn about her, I realized that there wasn't much that she didn't touch. She was involved in so much stuff, many things like the United Negro College Fund and so many other programs and initiatives that many of us know of today. Mary had her hand in a lot of it.
How many of you, you're my age, remember the mind is a terrible thing to waste phrase, right? It was one of those things that was, they had press with that, they had newspaper articles, it was everywhere, the PSAs on CBS Evening News, it was a vitally important shift in public perception. The idea that Blacks would go to college. First of all, in the 1930s, Blacks didn't go to college. Like I said, Bethune Cookman College was the first college in America that even let Black women come to them, right? So this was, and I think it was less than 1/10 of 1% of college students at this point were Black. So this idea of it's a imperative for us to make it possible for Blacks to go to college was a big deal. And again, we're all remember from the 50s and 60s when this really hit its stride, but she's the one that created this. And I think it was in 1944 she created it. So 1945, FDR dies, and Eleanor leaves the White House, and the first thing she does is join the board of the NAACP, which she couldn't do while she was the first lady. And her and Mary actually become quite engaged in a wide range of projects at this point. Now, Mary has left the federal government, and she's working a number of different jobs, but her role in the Black community has only gotten bigger. Which one? No, we cut that out. Because look, we've only got 3 minutes.
Oh, wow.
I'll talk about that after. We want to know about her meeting in Birmingham with Bull Connor.
So their relationship continued throughout, I would say, throughout the end of both of their lives. Until Mary died, their relationship continued, and Mary continued to work in some capacity. She, I would say, throughout all of her decades, she played an instrumental role. Her key tenets were always voting rights and education. She thought those were two very important things, and she found her way to make sure that her voice was still being heard on those two fronts up until the very end.
How important was she in the Black community? How about that? I think the recognition that the press sort of belatedly gave to her, again, because even the Black press was run by men, and although she got better coverage in the Black press than she did in the white press, it was still reluctantly given. And this idea that she became sort of the first lady of the Black movement, and this was bestowed upon her by Ebony. What was the other story about Ebony that you had?
Yes, Ebony magazine posted right before she passed away, she wrote what she entitled to be her last will and testament. And it wasn't necessarily her true legal document, but it was just a collection of her wisdom and insight that she had collected over the years. And she was leaving this, it was sort of like and when I read it now, and at the end, I'll talk about 2 books in particular, but when I was reading it, I really thought about how it is a blueprint for today. And it's amazing that even both of these women, both Eleanor and both Mary, that's what their life is. Their impact and their legacies are blueprints for how, when we find ourselves in times that are uncertain, challenging, and a lot of questions, that you can look to these 2 women, because what both of these women did were they were both very strategic thinkers. They were visionaries, and they knew how to play into their strengths. They knew the importance of collaboration and partnerships. They knew the importance of working within the system as well as disrupting the system when necessary. I asked Paul at the very beginning, why is it that when many of us think about great Black female leaders, the first ones that come to mind are Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman? We don't really get to Mary. And we had that discussion of why is that someone who was so impactful, who was so inspirational, and who touched on every aspect. I mean, one thing that we're not going to really discuss, but towards the end, she opened a beach. She had other businesses, but it was a Black beach in Daytona. So Black patrons could visit and could rest and could be in community with each other. There was nothing that Mary didn't do. So you wonder, why is it that someone who has achieved so much that she did, and who literally had the ear of the president through his wife, but it was more than just that. She really played such a pivotal role in shaping a lot of things that we know now. And, we explored, why is it that she isn't as well known? And what I remember your answer, would you mind sharing what your answer was?
Well, it's because she worked within the system, and she used the power that was granted her. I went back to check, and there's an online resource called the Day by Day FDR's Presidency, and you can search. And she met with the president 25 times. So she wasn't on the outside. She met face to face with him a large number of times. Again, despite the fact that all the people in the outer offices around the Oval Office would do anything they could to prevent her from getting to him, but she got to him. So this picture was taken at Bethune Cookman College, 1955, right before she died. And I just love the dignity, and the strength that she shows. She had been quite ill the last few years of her life. She had struggled with illness for about 10 years. So she was in poor health, and yet never wavering in her strength. Now, after her death, of course, Eleanor continued the good fight. So Mary lived long enough to see Brown versus Board of Education pass the Supreme Court, which of course was a monumental success in her world. And again, she was involved with those court cases and with that effort, sort of behind the scenes. Here you see Eleanor with Martin Luther King, but here's one of my favorite pictures. So this is Dorothy Height, who sort of took over Mary's role as the leading Black woman in the movement, presenting to Eleanor Roosevelt the Mary McLeod Bethune Award. Do you want to talk about that, or go to the last one? We're running a touch late, but
we can go to the last one, and this is a statue of Mary that is in the Capitol. It is in the Capitol. So we now have a statue of Mary, and I believe she is only one of 2 women that may.
Right, and only one Black.
And only one Black. She's the only Black American in there, and only one of 2 women to have a statue in the Capitol. So it is great that she is getting the recognition that she well deserves. And it is great that there have been, in recent times, there have been books. There is a great historical fiction book that many of you may know called The First Ladies, that highlights their relationship, the relationship between Eleanor and Mary. And this has been a great resource that I use, called A Passionate Mind in Relentless Pursuit, The Vision of Mary McLeod Bethune. This is a book. Both books are, in fact, available through the Delaware Library System. So if you would like to check them out, you can. And one thing before we go to questions, I wanted to just leave us with this one bit. It was about, in her last will and testament that was published in Ebony magazine, she listed that she leaves you finally a responsibility to our young people. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but she says, we have a powerful potential in our youth, and we must have the courage to change the old ideas and practices so that we may direct their power toward good ends. Faith, courage, brotherhood, dignity, ambition, responsibility, these are needed today as never before. We must cultivate them and use them as tools for our task of completing the establishment of equality for the Negro. We must sharpen these tools in the struggles that face us and find new ways of using them. The freedom gates are half ajar. We must pry them fully open. If I have a legacy to leave my people, it is my philosophy of living and serving. As I face tomorrow, I am content, for I think I have spent my life well. I pray now that my philosophy may be helpful for those who share my vision of a world of peace, progress, brotherhood, and love. So I thought that was very poignant that she had that for us.
I saw Rebecca make a face, so I think there's a fact check coming on the, was there, actually,
About the Capitol.
Frederick Douglass, maybe, statue of Frederick Douglass, maybe in the Capitol Rotunda. Yeah, she gave me a look like, yeah, Paul, that's not true. So we know there's only 2 women, but there may be more than 2 blacks. So anyway, so we're happy to take questions now, but please, round of applause for Shanta. Isn't she fabulous?
And around for Paul as well.
We're going to bring the bring the microphone around. Raise your hand if you have questions. We need you to be on mic so that the people on Zoom can hear you.
Yeah, and I know that the one question that did come in, people wanted to know the name of the movie, and just to confirm it again, it's the 6888 spelled out, and that is available on Netflix. And there's a very sweet message from your daughter that I'm not going to read that she posted on Zoom, but she has been adorable to watch. She is so proud of her mommy.
I'm glad you're watching, Corinne.
Anyway, so for folks who are joining us on home, if you want to post your question, and then for folks in the room, I know Jesse is back there working the microphone, and I'll help as well. So, questions?
That remarkable picture of the black cabinet. Can either one of you identify a few of the other folks in that picture?
It's online. You can identify. They have the caption that identifies all of them. But again, William Hastie, who is the highest ranking black in the Justice Department, Robert Vann, the publisher. Go ahead.
Tuskegee Institute president was probably there too.
No, he was not part of the federal government. Those are all federal employees. And pretty much they represent all of the federal employees who were in custodial jobs, right? But I off the top of my head, unless you
catching a blank.
Yeah, but if you search Black Cabinet, and there's a fabulous book by a woman named Jill Watts. She's a professor out in California called The Black Cabinet, which goes into a lot of details. I interviewed her up at when I was up at the library, and she really explains sort of the humiliations and the challenges that all of the members of Black Cabinet faced, and the arc that they went through. Because by the middle of the war, again, the white racists were trying to get the blacks out of the government because they were getting in the way of what they wanted to accomplish. And it's really quite sort of shocking how important federal employment was in the creation of the black middle class in the Washington area particularly, and the resistance all the way through the 1960s of preventing blacks from having access to federal employment.
Talk a little bit about her home life. You made mention of the fact that she had one son, but it sounds like a really lonely existence. Even though she was very busy, did she have companionship?
It doesn't appear after her separation from her husband. It was interesting to know, I don't know if it was in this book or something somewhere else I read, that at one point she referred to herself as a widow, even though her estranged husband was still alive. And they were, I guess they divorced, or were they just separated? I don't even recall. But it doesn't appear, and there's not much reference to her son at all. And it doesn't appear that throughout the rest that she had any other companionship or any other type of partner. Yeah, so it seems like her passion and all of her time was spent.
She traveled
Uplifting.
extensively, and she had financial issues, especially towards the end of her life after she left the federal employ. Because first of all, blacks were paid less than white men, and black women were paid less than white women, and certainly a lot less than black men. So, you know, there were always financial pressures on her. So she had a hard life. I mean, it was very difficult for her to do what she did, and she never compromised. She would, after she left the federal government, she was put on some boards and things like that. And she said she was a businessman and she went back to the university, but it was a very hard life. And I think you're absolutely right. It was a very lonely life.
Someone online said that the son died in 1919 from TB. Does
That's
that?
probably why.
Oh,
it
yeah,
doesn't show up
because somebody
there.
else had asked, did he get involved in politics? So thinking the answer is no. And there are actually 4 statues.
For African Americans in the statuary hall?
Yeah, so you have Daisy Lee Gatson Bates, placed in 2024, Dr. Mary, Frederick Douglass, and Rosa Parks.
Oh,
Well, curious, in the Black Cabinet, how many of those, if you know, would have required Senate confirmation?
I don't know the answer. That's a great question. Probably none of them, because they wouldn't have gotten it. And I think that's why none of them are in like assistant secretary status. They're all directors or staff, you know, civil service staff. But I don't think, I'm trying to think, it probably wasn't until Carl Rowan became a Black cabinet member under Johnson that you had a first time the Senate had to confirm a Black to that position, but I'm not positive on that. But maybe Weaver, right? Any other questions? Got one over here and one over here. Over here.
What was Frances Perkins' relationship with Mary, since they were 2 unwanted women in that Roosevelt cabinet?
Well, they actually worked closely together because the National Youth Organization, National Youth Administration, came under the Labor Department, and so Mary's boss reported to Frances, and Frances was very, very supportive of the National Youth Association because she knew, excuse me, how important it was to provide employment for these young people. Because, you know, if you don't give them jobs, they're just sitting on the street corner causing trouble, right? And so not just white kids that needed to be put to work, but the Black kids, especially the families that had been kicked off their farms. Because remember, there was a large percentage of sharecroppers, Black sharecroppers in the South, for whom the Great Depression was catastrophic. They lost what little they had. You know, they were forced onto the street. There was essentially no infrastructure for supporting them. So she knew how important it was. One job could support an entire family, you know, in that period. And so I don't have a great anecdote about their relationship, but I do know that they worked together and that Frances was a big fan of Mary's.
All right, so we have more fact checking happening. It's like live. So apparently it was the husband that died of TB. The son went on and was an owner and operator of Bethune Funeral Home for 25 years. And he died in 1989 at the age of 90. And he lived in Daytona Beach for most of his life. There was a question over here.
Thank you, whoever did that fact check.
Just a very basic question. What was the difference in ages between Eleanor Roosevelt?
Mary was about 10 years older. Eleanor was born in 1884. I think Mary was born in 1875. Yeah, so they were about 10 years old. But again, Mary had health issues because she had a very difficult life. You know, whereas Eleanor had the best of everything always. But I think the age difference was not important in their relationship, other than the fact that Mary died almost 8 years before Eleanor did. But it's a good question because they were of the same generation, but they grew up in totally different worlds. Over there?
Yeah, earlier you threw out a comment about Mary meeting with Bull Connor in Birmingham. Do you have time for that?
Okay, here we
Think
go.
we do.
All right. So there was a meeting of the Southern Human Rights Commission in Birmingham. So they brought people from all over the country who were involved in human rights, not just civil rights, for this meeting. And on the first night, there was a big, sort of cocktail reception type of thing you always have at a conference. And it was in Birmingham, Alabama, and they met at this ballroom, I guess, at a hotel, and the blacks and whites mixed. And the word got out, and it was a gross violation of the Birmingham Code of Ethics. So the next morning, there was going to be a meeting where they were going to have speakers and everything. And when everybody came in and started sitting down, Bull Connor was the sheriff at this point. And Eleanor came in and she sat down, I believe with Mary and a couple of other of the black civil rights leaders on the colored side. Well, first they all sat down, and then Connor came in and said, no, blacks have to sit on this side, whites have to sit on this side. You cannot, anyone who violates the law will be arrested. And then after he had separated them, Eleanor arrives, and she comes in and she sits down in the black side. And Connor comes over and says, you can't sit there, Mrs. Roosevelt. And she says, why not? She says, well, it's insist on sitting there, I'll have to arrest you. And so there's this sort of moment between Eleanor and Bull Connor, who we know later on, he's the guy with the dogs and the fire hoses, right? And so she sort of assesses the situation, right? What am I going to do? Am I going to get arrested? So she gets up, she picks up her chair, she moves it into the center of the aisle and sits down exactly halfway between the blacks and the whites. And he comes over to her again. He says, Mrs. Roosevelt, you can't sit there. And she goes, oh, I think I can. So now Connor is faced with the challenge. Am I going to arrest the first lady when she's not technically breaking the law? So he goes back and she sits in the middle of the aisle. And it was one of those statements. So for all the people in the room, obviously, this was a pretty dramatic moment. But it's the pebble in the pond, right? The ripples of that in the black community, knowing that the first lady defied one of the most vile, black oppressors, in the South in such a public forum, really said a lot about her courage, said a lot about the world that they lived in at that point. And it was one of those things that gave Eleanor tremendous street cred, with the black community, that she was willing to put herself on the line like that when she didn't have to. She could have just sat over on the white side. Nobody would have thought anything of it, but she didn't. And I think that's the story. I can actually go on for about 15 minutes if you want,
and I like that. I like when Paul first mentioned the story to me, and as we were talking about it, because I think it also shows that Eleanor was just such a wise person. That's wisdom, because that's a split-second decision. When you look at public figures today, even those who are leaders, they have a team around them that's what they say, smart people surround themselves with even smarter people. There's a team of counsel around them and advisors who would be walking them through this situation, because that's a situation that was rife of landmines. But Eleanor was so wise and so smart, and that was a split-second decision, a choice that she made in the moment, and it was the right choice to make. And I think that just screams and talks about just who she was as a person. And again, knowing, because if anything else, the story would have been about her, and it just would have been about her, and that wasn't her intention at all. She wanted to send a message, and she wanted to send a message of support, but she didn't want to dominate the conversation. And that was a decision that she made by herself. And I think that is just tremendous, because today, again, it would be a team of advisors who would be in her ear. You can't do this, First Lady. You shouldn't do this, ma'am. Don't do it. That was her call in the moment, and she made the right decision.
Do we have time for one more question? Do we have one more question right up here?
So you talked about the inclusion of blacks in the military, but the the forces were still completely segregated. Yes.
Yes.
I mean, my grandfather talked about being in charge of Black troops in Savannah, Illinois, during the war. So, okay, you can be in, but you have your own completely separate, not equal, right?
This was one of the big issues. And actually, FDR did appoint the first Black general in the war. So yes, there were very few Black units that weren't commanded by a white officer. And a vast majority of the Blacks who did serve were forced to serve in what they call support positions. They were cooks, they were chefs, they were stevedores, occasionally they were truck drivers. But as the war went on, you get out in the battlefield, especially like during the Battle of the Bulge and during Italy, it got really messy, right? And when you got a bunch of bad guys chasing you with guns, anybody that's wearing an American uniform, pick up a gun, all of a sudden you're Blacks and whites fighting together. The Battle of the Bulge and Italy, particularly Anzio, are good examples of where that racist breakdown of whites are over here, Blacks are over here, it sort of goes away. And then, of course, you all know about the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen, how distinguished their career was, especially in Italy. Again, they had some of the highest success rates in their missions. Lots of them were decorated. As the war went on, it was a de facto desegregation. Officially, they couldn't mingle, but the reality is, when the bullets are flying, you're going to do what you need to do. One of the most intransigent was the U.S. Navy, and of course, I can't remember his name. Who remembers the name of the Black sailor in Pearl Harbor who manned the machine gun and was shooting at the Japanese planes as they were sinking? What? Anyway, this was one of those stories where he's not allowed to touch that weapon, and yet, planes are dropping bombs and people are dying, and he gets on that machine gun and fires, and it's sort of things like that start that breakdown. But the military leadership was absolutely opposed to any sort of integration, and particularly with the Navy. We can't put Blacks on the ships with white guys because they're not going to get along. And of course, Truman comes along and finally desegregates the military. And although there are a lot of hard times, guess what? It worked. So I think in Korea, you start to see the first time where you had truly integrated military units in combat. And that's it. So thank you all.
And I just have one quick comment. Again, thank you, Paul, for inviting me to be in conversation with you. And thank you for all that you do.
Shanta.
And then I also would just ask that everyone please to continue to support us here. Our plan is to continue to have these conversations for as long as we can. And in my mind, that's forever.
Thank you.
Just support us as we continue to bring these on. And thank you again, Rebecca.
Thank you all.